The dust rose first, before the sound of the wagon wheels ever reached her ears, and Ruth Calloway stood in the doorway of her sagging ranch house with a hand shading her eyes against the Nebraska sun, watching the Hollister brothers haul their broken silo staves toward the scrap heap behind Kessler's mill. She had been waiting 3 days for this exact moment. Let me tell you about Ruth Calloway, because her name does not appear in any history book worth its binding, and yet what she built with her own 2 hands in the spring of 1881 changed the way half a county thought about what a widow alone on a played-out ranch could accomplish with nothing but patience and a stubborn refusal to be told no. Her husband, Amos, had died the previous autumn, thrown from a horse spooked by a rattler out along the north fence line, and the ranch he left behind was 40 acres of hard clay soil, a barn with a roof that leaked in 3 places, and a house with a dirt floor that turned to mud every time it rained hard enough to seep beneath the walls. The neighbors had expected her to sell within the year. Most widows did out here, because a ranch without a man to work it was considered a debt waiting to collect itself. Ruth had other plans, though she kept them mostly to herself, because a woman who spoke her plans out loud in that part of the territory generally found them mocked before she ever got the chance to try them. She walked out to the Hollister brothers as they were unloading the last of the cracked silo staves, curved wooden planks that had once held together a grain silo before the whole structure buckled under a hard winter and had to be torn down. The staves were split in places, warped from years of holding grain, good for nothing but kindling as far as anyone in town figured, which was exactly why the Hollisters were happy enough to be rid of them. "Afternoon," Ruth said, and the older Hollister brother, a broad-shouldered man everyone called Big Ned, straightened up from the wagon bed and looked at her with the particular expression men reserved for a woman who had wandered somewhere she was not expected to be. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "you lost?" "I came for those staves," she said, nodding toward the pile already forming near the scrap heap. "The broken ones you're hauling out. I'd like to buy the lot." Big Ned laughed, short and genuine, the kind of laugh that came from real surprise rather than cruelty, though it stung all the same. "Ma'am, these are cracked clean through. Good for a fire and not much else. You don't want these." "I do want them," Ruth said. "What would you take for the whole load?" The younger Hollister brother, leaning against the wagon wheel with his arms crossed, snorted quietly enough to be heard, but not loud enough to be called out directly for it. Big Ned glanced at his brother, then back at Ruth, and something in his face shifted from amusement into the kind of patient condescension that men sometimes mistook for kindness. "Tell you what," he said, "you can have them for free, Mrs. Calloway. Save us the trouble of hauling them another mile to the burn pile. But I'll tell you plain, whatever you're thinking of doing with warped silo wood, it won't hold. This lumber's been swelling and shrinking with grain moisture for 8 years. It's got no give left in it. It'll crack the second you try to build with it." "I'm not going to build with it," Ruth said. "Not the way you're thinking." Big Ned did not ask what she meant by that. He simply shrugged, the way a man shrugs at something he has already decided is not worth further consideration, and helped her load the broken staves into the back of her own wagon, still chuckling under his breath in a way that made her jaw tighten, though she said nothing more about it. "Now, let me ask you something, because it is worth pausing on before the story moves forward. What do you do with wood that everyone around you has already declared useless. Most people in Ruth's position would have taken the free lumber and burned it for warmth through the coming winter, grateful for fuel that cost nothing and asked nothing in return. That would have been the sensible choice. That would have been the choice nobody would have questioned. Ruth had a different idea entirely, one she had been turning over in her mind since the week after Amos died, when she stood in her kitchen and watched rainwater seep up through the packed dirt floor and pool around the legs of the table, ruining the hem of every dress she owned and turning the whole house into something closer to a barn stall than a home. She did not want new lumber for a proper wood floor, because proper lumber cost money she did not have and would take months to order from the mill in Lincoln, even if she did. What she wanted was something permanent, something that water could not ruin, that would not warp or splinter or need replacing every few years the way wood floors eventually did in a climate that swung between drought and downpour with no warning at all. She wanted a poured floor, a hard, smooth, lasting floor made from lime and sand and crushed limestone, the kind of floor she had seen described once in a farming almanac Amos kept in a drawer, an article about settlers back east using a mixture they called a lime concrete, poured wet into place and left to cure hard as stone. The trouble was, she did not have the crushed limestone the article called for, not in the quantity she would need, and hauling enough stone from the quarry 2 counties over would have cost more than she had to her name. What she did have, sitting cracked and warped in the back of her wagon, was 8 years' worth of silo staves that had spent nearly a decade absorbing lime dust from the grain they once held. Let me explain what that meant, because it matters more than it might sound like at first. Grain silos in that era were often lined and treated with lime to control moisture and pests, and over years of use, that lime worked its way into the grain of the wood itself, saturating the fibers with a mineral content that ordinary lumber never carried. Ruth had noticed it first as a girl, growing up on her family's own farm further south, watching her father burn old lime-treated fence posts and noting the strange white ash that remained afterward. Ash that behaved differently from ordinary wood ash when it got wet, hardening instead of simply washing away. She had filed that memory away for years without ever having a use for it, the way a person files away all manner of small observations that seem to serve no purpose until suddenly they do. What Ruth intended to do with the broken silo staves was burn them down to that lime-rich ash, sift it clean of char and debris, and combine it with sand hauled from the dry creek bed on the eastern edge of her property, along with whatever crushed rock she could break down herself with a sledgehammer from the limestone outcropping near the north fence line, the very fence line where Amos had died the autumn before. It was slow work. It was work that required more patience than most people in that county believed a woman alone could sustain. And it was work that nobody, not the Hollister brothers, not her nearest neighbors, the Pruitts, not even the minister who came by twice that spring to check on her welfare, believed would come to anything worth the effort. She began by building a burn pit behind the barn, digging it deep enough to contain a hot, controlled fire, and she spent the better part of 2 weeks feeding the broken silo staves into that pit a few pieces at a time, watching them burn down slow and complete, rather than letting the fire rage too fast and waste the lime content in half-charred wood. It was hot, filthy work. Her hands blistered before the first week was through, and the smoke stung her eyes red and raw most evenings, but she kept at it with the same stubbornness that had gotten her through the winter after Amos died, when she had chopped her own firewood and mended her own fences and learned, out of necessity, that a body could do far more than anyone, including herself, had ever expected. Word traveled fast in a county that small. By the second week, folks driving past on the county road had started slowing their wagons to watch the widow Calloway feeding scrapped lumber into a smoking pit behind her barn. And the talk in town, according to what the Pruitts' eldest daughter reported back to her, was not kind. They said she had lost her senses with grief. They said a woman alone on a ranch that size, with no husband and no sons to help her, had no business burning good scrap instead of selling it or using it for winter fuel like any sensible person would. Big Ned Hollister, when he heard what she was doing with the staves he had given her for free, reportedly laughed so hard at the mill that he had to sit down on a grain sack to catch his breath. Ruth heard about the laughter second-hand, the way a person always hears about the things said behind their back. And she kept working anyway, because she had learned something in the months since Amos died that she suspected most of her critics had never had to learn themselves. She had learned that other people's certainty about what she could or could not accomplish was not, in fact, a reliable measure of anything at all. By the end of the third week, she had ash enough to begin the next stage, and this was where the real precision of the work began. She sifted the burned lime ash through an old flour sack stretched tight over a wooden frame, separating the fine white powder from the char and larger unburned fragments, a process that took her the better part of 4 days, working alone in the barn with the doors open for light and air. The powder that remained, once sifted clean, was a lime so pure it burned faintly when it touched the moisture on her skin, and she learned quickly to wear an old pair of Amos's leather work gloves whenever she handled it directly. Next came the sand, hauled bucket by bucket from the dry creek bed nearly half a mile from the house, a walk she made dozens of times over the following 2 weeks, her shoulders aching under the weight of the yoke she rigged from a length of old harness leather to carry 2 buckets at once. The creek sand was coarse and clean, free of the clay content that would have weakened the final mixture, and she sifted that too, removing pebbles and debris until what remained was fine and consistent. The crushed limestone was the hardest part of all. She spent entire afternoons at the north fence line with a sledgehammer, breaking down chunks of the natural outcropping into pieces small enough to crush further with a heavy iron mortar and pestle she had borrowed from the Pruitts, who lent it to her more out of curiosity than genuine belief that her project would amount to anything. Her palms split and bled more than once during those weeks. She wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from an old petticoat and kept working, because stopping had never once occurred to her as an option worth considering. That was when she made the mistake, if you could call it a mistake, of underestimating just how much material a floor of that size would actually require. Her house was small by most standards, a single main room with a bedroom off to the side, perhaps 400 square feet total. But 400 square feet of poured lime concrete required far more raw material than she had originally calculated. And by the 6th week of work, she realized with a sinking feeling that the ash from the silo staves alone would not be enough to complete the job. She sat on the porch step that evening, staring out at the pile of sand and crushed limestone she had gathered, calculating and recalculating in her head. And for the first time since she had started the project, doubt crept in fully enough to make her wonder if the Hollister brothers and everyone else in town had been right about her all along. But quitting, she decided, would waste everything she had already put into the work. All those weeks of blistered hands and smoke-stung eyes and aching shoulders. And something in her refused to let that effort simply evaporate into nothing because the math had not worked out the way she originally hoped. She went back to the Hollister mill the following morning, and this time she did not ask for scrap lumber. She asked whether they had any more broken staves, cracked barrel staves, worn-out fence posts treated with lime, anything at all that had spent years absorbing lime content the way the silo wood had. Big Ned looked at her for a long moment, the amusement from weeks before replaced by something more careful, more curious, though he still clearly did not understand what she intended to do with any of it. "You're really building something with that ash," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am," Ruth said. "A floor. A poured floor, hard as stone, that won't turn to mud every time it rains." Big Ned was quiet for a moment, and then, to her genuine surprise, he nodded slowly and said his mill had a whole stack of old lime-treated fence posts sitting behind the equipment shed, replaced the previous year and never disposed of, and she was welcome to take every last one of them if it meant finally clearing the space. She hauled that load home in 2 trips, her wagon groaning under the weight, and spent another 2 weeks burning and sifting the additional material, her burn pit smoking steadily behind the barn through what remained of a spring that had turned unseasonably warm and dry, weather that at least made the ash sifting easier, even as it worried her about the coming summer's crops. By the middle of the 7th week, she had what she believed was enough material to begin the actual pour, and this was the moment, she would say years later, when the real test of everything she had learned finally arrived. Mixing lime concrete correctly required a precision that raw enthusiasm alone could not substitute for. Too much lime and the mixture would crack as it cured, brittle and prone to crumbling underfoot within a season. Too little, and the floor would never harden fully, remaining soft and vulnerable to the very moisture problem she was trying to solve in the first place. The ratio had to be close to exact, and she had no formal training to draw from beyond the fragments of that old almanac article, and whatever she could reason out through careful observation and trial. She mixed a small test batch first in an old washtub, combining measured portions of lime, sand, and crushed limestone with creek water, working the mixture with a wooden paddle until it reached a consistency that felt right beneath her hands, thick enough to hold its shape, but wet enough to spread smooth. She poured that test batch into a shallow wooden frame she had built in the yard and left it to cure for 3 full days, checking it morning and evening, pressing her thumb gently against the surface to test its hardness. On the 3rd morning, the test slab had hardened into something solid and cool to the touch, pale gray and smooth, and when she struck it firmly with the flat of a hammer, it rang out with a hard, dense sound that told her everything she needed to know. The ratio was right. The lime from those broken silo staves had done exactly what she hoped it would do. She wept a little that morning, alone in the yard, though she would never have admitted that to anyone who asked. And then she wiped her face and went back to work, because a test slab was not a floor, and there was still an entire house waiting to be transformed. The actual pour took the better part of 2 more weeks, working in careful sections since she had no way to mix and pour an entire room's worth of material all at once, alone. She cleared the packed dirt floor of her house first, digging it down several inches to make room for a gravel base she laid by hand, bucket by bucket, tamping it firm with the flat end of a fence post. Over that base, she poured her lime concrete mixture in sections, roughly 4 feet square, working the surface smooth with a wooden float she carved from a scrapboard, moving from one section to the next, only once the previous pour had set enough to bear the careful weight of her footsteps around its edges. It was during this stretch of work that the whole county truly began to take notice. Not because anyone had suddenly come to believe in what she was doing, but because the sheer scope of the labor had become impossible to ignore. Neighbors driving past on their way to town would slow their wagons to watch her hauling water and mixing material in the yard, and the talk shifted subtly from mockery into something closer to bewildered curiosity, though plenty of the old skepticism remained stubbornly intact. Mrs. Pruitt came by one afternoon, ostensibly to return the mortar and pestle Ruth had borrowed weeks before, though it was clear enough her real purpose was simply to see the strange project for herself. She stood in the doorway of the house, looking down at the pale gray sections of hardened floor already covering nearly half the main room, and her expression shifted from polite skepticism into something more thoughtful. "It's smooth," she said, crouching to press her palm against the surface. "Smoother than I expected." "It'll be smoother still once I finish and let the whole thing cure proper," Ruth said. "Give it another month and you could roll a marble across it and it wouldn't catch on a thing." "Where'd you learn to do this?" Mrs. Pruitt asked, and there was genuine curiosity in the question now, stripped of the condescension that had colored most conversations about Ruth's project since it began. "Nowhere, really," Ruth admitted. "An old almanac article, mostly. The rest I worked out myself, one mistake at a time." Mrs. Pruitt was quiet for a moment, still crouched with her palm against the cool, hard surface. "My husband said you'd never manage it. Said lime concrete needed a mason's training, not guesswork from a farm widow with no formal schooling in it." "Your husband might still be right," Ruth said, though there was no bitterness in the observation, only plain honesty. "I won't know for certain until it's finished and holds up through a full winter." But it did hold, and that is the part of the story that Ruth herself liked to tell slowest of all, savoring the details the way a person savors a memory they have earned the right to be proud of. By early summer, the entire floor was poured and cured, a single continuous surface of pale gray stone hard concrete spanning both rooms of her small house, smooth and level and utterly impervious to the rain that had once turned her home into something closer to a mud pit every time a storm rolled through. She scrubbed it clean with creek water and a stiff brush, and the surface gleamed faintly in the afternoon light, cool beneath bare feet even on the hottest days, warm enough near the hearth on cold evenings to hold heat through the night in a way packed dirt never had. Word of the finished floor spread through the county faster than word of the strange burning and mixing ever had, and it was not long before curious neighbors began finding reasons to visit, ostensibly for other purposes, though everyone understood the real draw was seeing the widow Calloway's floor with their own eyes. Big Ned Hollister came by himself near the end of that summer, driving out under the pretense of checking whether she needed any more scrap material for future projects, though Ruth suspected plainly enough that curiosity alone had brought him. He stood in her doorway for a long moment, looking down at the smooth gray expanse of floor stretching across both rooms, and for once he did not laugh. "I told you this wood had no give left in it," he said finally. "Told you it'd crack the second you tried to build with it." "You did," Ruth agreed, without any particular satisfaction in her voice, simply stating a fact. "I was thinking about it wrong," Big Ned admitted, crouching to run his palm across the cool, hard surface, much the way Mrs. Pruitt had done weeks before. "Thought you meant to build with the wood itself. Never occurred to me you meant something else entirely." "Most people don't think past the obvious use of a thing," Ruth said. "Doesn't make them foolish. Just means they haven't had reason yet to think past it." Big Ned was quiet for a long moment, studying the floor with an expression that had shifted somewhere between respect and genuine curiosity. "How'd a body even come up with an idea like this?" "Necessity, mostly," Ruth said, "and paying attention to things other folks throw away without asking themselves what those things might still be good for." That conversation, more than any other, marked the real turning point in how the county came to regard Ruth Calloway. It was not a single dramatic moment of vindication so much as a slow accumulation of small shifts. Neighbors who had once dismissed her outright, now stopping by to ask questions about the process, curious whether the same technique might work for their own homes, their own barns, their own root cellars prone to flooding every spring. She began helping others with their own floors that following year, not for pay at first, simply out of the satisfaction of passing along something she had worked so hard to learn through trial and painful error. Eventually, as word spread further beyond the immediate county, people began offering to pay her for her time and expertise, and what had started as a desperate solution to a leaking dirt floor slowly transformed into something closer to a trade, one that kept her ranch solvent through years when many neighboring widows lost their land entirely for lack of income or labor. Now let me ask you something else, because this is the part of the story that matters most, beyond the technical details of lime and sand and crushed limestone. What do you suppose it cost Ruth Calloway to keep working through 8 weeks of blistered hands and smoke-stung eyes and a county full of neighbors laughing behind her back? It was not simply physical labor, though the labor itself was considerable. It was the harder cost of holding steady against near-universal certainty that she was wasting her time, that a woman alone, widowed and unschooled in any formal trade, had no business attempting something the men around her considered beyond her capability. She held steady anyway. That, more than the floor itself, is the real inheritance of this story. The quiet, stubborn insistence that other people's doubt was not sufficient reason to abandon something she believed, through careful reasoning and hard-won experience, could actually work. Ruth lived on that ranch for another 11 years before eventually passing it to her sister's family, who kept the poured floor intact for decades afterward, patching small cracks here and there, but never once needing to replace the fundamental structure of what she had built with scrap lumber and stubborn patience back in the spring of 1881. Visitors to the property generations later would sometimes ask about the unusual floor, smoother and more durable than anything else built in that era using similar methods. And the answer, passed down through family memory, always circled back to the same story. They laughed when the poor widow asked for their scrapped silo staves. They laughed harder when she started burning them down to ash in a pit behind her barn. But nobody was laughing by the time she poured that first hardened slab and struck it with a hammer to hear it ring out solid and true. Because a woman who refuses to let other people's certainty define the limits of what she can accomplish has a way of proving, eventually, that the laughter said far more about the people doing the laughing than it ever said about her. That, in the end, is the whole of it. Not a story about lime and sand and broken silo wood, not really. A story about what happens when someone decides that being underestimated is not the same thing as being wrong, and holds to that decision through every blistered, smoke-choked, doubt-filled week it takes to prove it.